Okay, okay. So in the previous question, talked about whether or not the existence of God can be demonstrated. The two main points, Aquinas says that he will argue for the existence of God based on the effects, argue back from the effects which we can perceive in this world to what their ultimate cause must be. So he says he can prove the existence of God, reasoning backwards from the effects. And the other thing is that he says the existence of God is not an article of faith, as he puts it. It's a preamble to the articles of faith. So he says you can accept on faith that God exists if you can't follow the proofs, if you don't understand them. You can always accept on faith that God doesn't exist, and there's nothing wrong with that. But he says it doesn't have to be accepted on faith. The existence of God can be demonstrated using natural reason. So he says the existence of God by itself is not actually an article of faith. It's, as he puts it, a preamble to an article of faith. So those are sort of the two main points from the previous, from Article 2. So then we move on to Article 3, whether God exists. And here we'll start with Aquinas's, his own statement of his position, the sed contra. He cites the statement of God from Exodus, I am who am, or I am the one who is, or different ways you can translate it. But, basically, this definition or this name that God gives of himself stresses his existence. So Aquinas is very fundamental to what the Bible tells us about God is that God exists, obviously. So he says, I answer that the existence of God can be proved in 5 ways. Okay, he says the first way that he focuses on is motion, and he says he focuses on that first. He says because it's the most manifest, as he puts it. It's the most obvious to our senses. We see things in motion. And so, why are they in motion? We can see that things are in motion. We can see people running around outside, a bird flying, a leaf falling off a tree. So we can see that there's motion in the world. Now, his argument for motion actually relies a lot on these ideas of potentiality and actuality. So we won't actually focus a lot on that, on trying to reconstruct or explain exactly what all that means. But again, the key is he's saying, look, let's begin from what our senses concede. There's motion. And yet we can't have, we ultimately have to explain where this motion comes from. And he says, and that's how you can prove the existence of God. Again, effects that are clear to our senses, like motion, we trace them back and we figure out, again, in this example, that something has to be, well, basically, we can sort of simplify it by, as he puts it, there has to be a first mover put in motion by other. In other words, an unmoved first mover. And he says, this everyone understands to be God. And this is part of what he keeps doing, is coming back to this idea that, what we can establish exist is what everybody means by God. People who believe in God, people who don't believe in God, people who believe in the Bible, people who don't, this is everyone, these things that we can establish exist, like a first unmoved mover. That's what everybody means by God. That's what everyone understands to be God. Whatever else they believe about God, that's part of what they understand or believe about God. So he says, that basically, he says, things are in motion. We have to trace that motion back to a first unmoved mover. Again, we won't get into the details of how he does this in terms of potentiality and actuality and so on. We'll just say that, he says that there has to be a first unmoved mover, which is the cause of other motion. And he says, and that is what everybody understands to be God. Okay, so the second way is from the nature of efficient cause. And here, very briefly, we can talk about what Aristotle called the 4 causes. So he uses the example of a bronze chalice, for instance. The material cause is the bronze that it's made out of. The formal cause is the actual form that the chalice has that causes it to be a chalice rather than a candlestick or just a shapeless mass of bronze. The efficient cause is the bronze worker who actually takes shapeless bronze and shapes it into a chalice. So that's the efficient cause, the thing that causes it to assume the form that it has. The final cause or the ultimate cause is for the sake of drinking. That's why it exists, for the purpose of being used to drink. So the 4 basic causes: material cause, what something is made out of; the formal cause, the actual physical form that it has; the efficient cause, the thing which is the efficient cause of it having the form that it has; the efficient cause, the thing that causes it to change into what it is, or that causes it causes it to have the form that it has; and then the final cause, the purpose for which it exists, the reason that it exists. So if you looked at human beings from Aquinas, what would Aquinas say about human beings? The material cause is all the stuff that we're made out of. the formal cause obviously is the form that we have as human beings. The efficient cause, there would be many. I mean, we could look at obviously generation or procreation, the efficient cause where we first come from, the efficient cause of keeping us alive through nutrition and so on, and then the final cause. Again, Aquinas would say the reason for which we exist is to know God and to know the truth generally, to know God in particular, to come closer to God and so on. The final cause for which we exist, though, ultimately is union with God. And so, this is sort of the four causes. Here he talks about efficient cause, and he basically says, obviously we see cause and effect. You strike a match, it bursts into flame. Burst is maybe a little dramatic, but you strike a match and it catches on fire. The head of the match catches on fire. There's cause and effect. You strike the match, it makes it burst into flame. So he says, there are causes in the world, and yet if we trace back the cause, there can't be simply an infinite line of one thing causing another. So it's sort of like, the efficient cause that brought me into existence was my parents. Their efficient cause was their parents. Their efficient cause was their parents, and so on. But Aquinas says you can't just have an infinite chain of one thing causing something else. Ultimately, there has to be a first cause. And he says that cause has to be uncaused by anything else. So he says at one point, in this explanation of the second way, he says nothing can be its own cause because that means it existed before itself, which is obviously impossible. So he says, that one thing is caused by another thing, and so on and so forth. But again, he says you can't have an infinite chain of one thing causing something else. You can't have an infinite chain of efficient causes. At some point, there has to be a first cause, and he says again that cause is, everyone gives the name God. And again, that first cause is not that it's the cause of itself, it's uncaused. It's something that exists without any cause at all. So again, he's not saying that God somehow went back in time and caused himself and so on. He says there's an uncaused first cause, which is the cause of everything else. The cause of everything else that we see, all the other chains and so on of cause that we have. If we trace that back, again, he says you can't have an infinite chain of causes. Therefore, the first cause, that there must be some first cause which is uncaused by anything else, any sort of uncaused first cause, and that, he says, is what everybody calls God. And that kind of takes us into the third way, because, well, what does it mean for something to be an uncaused cause? And the third way, in many ways, the most fundamental is, as he says, it's taken from possibility and necessity. For our purposes, it's sort of easier if we say contingency and necessity. So what is the difference between contingency and necessity? Or what is the difference between something being contingent and something being necessary? The simplest thing that it means is just that something that is contingent doesn't have to be. Something that is contingent could have not been the way that it is, could have not existed at all. Something that's necessary is necessary. So take a very simple example of a contingent truth. Today I'm wearing a silver tie. I could have worn a red tie. There's nothing necessary about the fact that I wore a silver tie. If in this room, if the walls are, let's just say, white, that's not necessary. They could have been painted yellow. They could have been painted brown. They could have been painted a slightly darker shade of off-white. There's nothing necessary about that. These are contingent truths. Okay, so let's start with necessary and contingent truth. Something that is contingently true is true. It's true that I'm wearing a silver tie, but it's not necessary. I could have worn a red tie. If this were a regular class, you would say so-and-so is in class today, but that wasn't necessary. They could have not come to class. They could have been sick. They could have just decided not to come. So it's true, but it's only a contingent truth. It didn't have to be. And whereas a necessary truth is something like, again, we can go back to a triangle has three sides. That's a necessary truth. That's just necessarily true. It's not, well, sometimes it does have three sides, sometimes a triangle has four sides. No, it's just necessary. It's always the truth that a triangle has three sides. And again, that's a necessary truth. The angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees, or as Aquinas sometimes says, two right angles. That's a necessary truth. It's true of every triangle. It is necessarily and therefore always true that the angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. So those are necessary truths. And again, those are things that we may have to demonstrate using reason, but once we do, we see them very clearly and we can't really explain why. Well, why does a triangle have three sides? Well, there's really no why. I mean, no, it's not like somebody got together and A group of people got together and made the decision for these reasons. And it's also, it's not the case that a triangle used to have 4 sides and then it changed for these reasons or something. Necessary truths, they're necessarily true. We can see that, but we can't really explain why. There's no real way that we can account for, why things have come to be this way. The angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. That's a necessary truth, but again, it's not that we can explain, well, this is the process by which this came to happen. Contingent truths, again, if this were a class and someone was in class today, that's a contingent truth. We could say, why did you come to class? They had their reasons. If they weren't in class, why aren't they in class? Well, they were sick or their car broke down or something. That you can explain why a contingent truth is true. You can explain how it came to happen that this state of affairs exists. You can explain why, or not just what the reasoning was, but also what were the causes that produced something. So why wasn't someone in class today? What were they thinking? But also, what were the causes that prevented them from coming to class? Whereas again, necessary truths, you can't really explain why they're true. They're necessarily true, but again, you can't really explain that. You can't really explain why they're true. So if we look at necessary and contingent truth in that way, and then it's sort of the same thing with being or with existence. Something that exists contingently, take me, so basically Aquinas says everything that we see in the world exists only contingently. Everything has come into being at some point, everything will pass away at some point, and so he says that's true of everything that we see in the world. So take me as an example. There was a time when I didn't exist. There's a time when when I'll die and I won't exist anymore. And again, we can explain, why. We can explain how I came to exist. I was conceived by my parents, and they gave birth. My mother gave birth to me, and you can also say, well, why am I alive now? Well, I've eaten and so on. You can explain, why I exist, because I exist only contingently. When I die, you'll be able to say, well, why did he die? Heart attack or old age, or he got eaten by a lion on a trip to Africa or something. You'll be able to explain why I don't exist anymore. Whereas something that exists necessarily, Aquinas says it's somewhat similar. We can't really explain why it exists. We can't really say, well, why is there this necessary thing? But even more, he says, in the world, all that we see are contingent things. But he says if all that exists are contingent things, again, things that exist only contingently, and part of being contingent means, a very fundamental part of it is, that you rely for your existence on something else. So again, I exist contingently. I exist only because of my parents. They're the ones who brought me into being, just as their parents brought them into being. And here it starts to sound similar to the argument from efficient cause. But again, what he's really saying is not so much cause, but that we rely for our existence on something else. And he says everything which exists only possibly or only contingently relies for its existence on something else. But he says, again, part of what it means to exist contingently is that there was a time when you didn't exist. But he says if the only things that exist are all contingent beings, and contingent beings by definition, there was a time when they didn't exist, and he says then there would be a time when nothing existed at all. But if there was a time when nothing at all existed, when nothing, then nothing can come out of nothing. If there was a time when there was just nothing in existence at all, then nothing can come out of that nothingness. It's impossible for things to start being created by nothing. So he says it's impossible for something to come out of nothing. So he says if there was a time when nothing existed, then nothing would exist now. But clearly things exist now. So he says, so there must be something which exists necessarily, which means that it always exists. Again, if something exists necessarily, it always exists. Just like if it's necessarily true, if it's a necessary truth that a triangle has 3 sides, then it's always true that a triangle has 3 sides. In the same way, a necessary being, something which exists necessarily, always exists. Again, that's what it would mean to exist necessarily, to be a necessary being. And so Aquinas says, if there were only contingent beings, then there would have been a time when nothing existed. But if that were true, if there was a time when nothing existed, then nothing would exist now. But clearly things do. So he says, so there must be something which is a necessary being. There must be something which exists necessarily. And again, he says, this is what everybody calls God, this necessary being. Okay? So a few important points here. One, sometimes people say, well, the universe exists necessarily. In the same way, you could go to the issue of efficient causes and say, well, why can't you just have an infinite chain of efficient causes? Maybe it's possible. And that's where, again, Aquinas would come back and say, but even then, you need a necessary being. You can't just have a series of efficient causes that are also contingent, because otherwise there would be a time when nothing had existed at all, and then nothing would ever have come out of that nothingness. So there has to be a necessary being, and if you say, okay, well, the necessary being is just the universe, maybe you can say that, but again, remember what Aquinas is saying is that everything that we see in the universe exists only contingently. So when he says that there must be something which exists necessarily, there must be a necessary being, it has to be something of a different order than anything that we see. So if you say, well, the universe exists necessarily, and if by that you just mean the totality of all of the contingently existing things that we see or that we can imagine are in the universe, that doesn't work, because again, you're still saying that they're only contingent things. If you group all of the contingent things into one category and call it the universe and say, well, that's necessary, well, no, because you're still just talking about contingent things. There has to be something, a necessary being, which, because it is a necessary being, is just of a different order of being, or a different order of existence than all of these contingently existing things that we have experience of and that we can, see or even just imagine or conceive of. So if the universe is necessary, it has to be the universe in a sense of something that is somehow different, maybe underlies everything else that we see, or is somehow the cause of the existence of all these other things. Again, not in the sense of an efficient cause, but in the sense of the thing which gives being, which gives existence to all of these contingently existing things. So, so for one thing, you can't just say, well, the universe exists necessarily without meaning something very different from what we actually see. And at that point, because again, here Aquinas is not arguing for he's not saying that he can prove the existence of the God of the Bible or the God of Christianity. He's saying only that he can prove the existence of something, it would be something like the God of Aristotle. So, it would be, you could kind of very roughly say here, he's not proving the existence of the God of Christianity or the God of the Bible. He's proving the existence of the God of Aristotle. And if you were to say, well, the universe, that exists necessarily, it's not really clear what you mean as a necessary cause. It's not really clear what you're doing by calling it the universe rather than God. As he says, well, that's what everybody means by God. They mean a necessary being. Again, not necessarily the God of the Bible, but some kind of necessary being, which is what makes it possible for anything else to exist. So again, just saying, well, the universe exists necessarily, you have to mean something different than just the totality of all the contingent things that we see. Secondly, you see here some of what Aquinas means by saying that reason or philosophy is a handmaiden to theology, or in the sense that reason can provide preambles to the articles of faith. So here he says, that reason shows us that there must be something which exists necessarily. There must be a necessary being in the world. And yet when we try to figure out using reason what that necessary being would be like, we really can't. I mean, reason tells us that it's there, but we really can't figure out that much about it just based on reason. Well, what is it like? What is its character? Just like with necessary truths, reason tells us that they're there, tells us that they're necessary, but if we try to say, well, why? Why does a triangle have three sides? Well, we can't really answer that. Why does a triangle have, why are the angles of a triangle always equal to 180 degrees rather than 190 degrees or 179 degrees or 250 or whatever? Well, we can't really explain why. That's just the way that it is. And Aquinas says it's the same way with necessary being. Reason can tell us that it's there, but it can't really explain why. It can't really tell very much about what that being would be like and so on. So that's where he's saying that it sort of, reason sort of shows that something must be there, but then also reveals its own limits, shows that it can't really say that much about what that necessary being would be. And therefore, as a preamble of faith, kind of, maybe Aquinas would say makes people more receptive to accepting faith, to listening ideas that people may have about what that God is like. Now, of course, Aristotle may come back and say, well, the fact that reason only takes you that far doesn't mean that you have to believe anything beyond that. In fact, maybe the reasonable thing is just not to believe anything beyond that, to say, this is what reason tells me. Beyond that, it's true. Reason can't tell me every single thing, but there's no particular reason to believe anything beyond what reason can tell me. And Aquinas might say, it's true. You can't compel belief in that way, but it shows that belief is reasonable to some extent, at least in the sense that this God must exist. Again, not that all of faith can be proved by reason, but it's sort of, again, he says, this is what he means by reason kind of providing a preamble for faith. Reason kind of showing that faith or that belief in the Christian God is not totally irrational, is not totally illogical. And again, sort of reason shows that there must be a necessary being, and also kind of shows its own limitation, that it kind of runs up against a wall here and says, there must be a necessary being, but why or what that being would be like, reason can't really tell me. So Aquinas would say, see, it sort of points to that. Again, Aristotle might come back and say, yes, but they're just because reason can't tell you what's there doesn't mean that you have to believe anything beyond what reason can tell you. So in any case, that's necessary being, the way from necessity and possibility. In many ways the most important. The fourth way is maybe the weakest. The fourth way, he says, is taken from the gradation found in things. So he says, we say some things are hotter, some things cold, some things are more noble or more true, and so on. But he says the only way that that makes sense, the only way that these quantitative differences make sense of saying more and less, is if there's some absolute notion of being, and in particular, something is best and so on, that if we say that if we're judging things as better or worse, that's because we have some absolute standard of good in mind that makes it possible for us to make these judgments. You could obviously reply and say that's maybe not true. I mean, if you rush into a burning house and save someone's life, you're doing something better for them than if you buy them a cup of coffee. It's more noble because you're taking obviously a greater risk than you are by buying them a cup of coffee. It's not clear that you need some absolute standard of nobility to make sense of that. Even more, I mean, he uses heat as an example, for instance. Obviously, you could just say, well, when it's 90 degrees outside, it's hotter than when it's 70 degrees. I don't need some absolute standard of heat to feel that. I can just tell it's hotter, it's warmer. Conversely, it's cooler when it's 40 degrees than when it's 60 degrees. Again, I don't really need some kind of absolute standard of hot or cold to tell me that. I can just tell when it's hotter and colder. So fourth way, maybe not totally convincing. The fifth way, as he says, is taken from the governance of the world. Excuse me. So he says, we see that things that lack intelligence, such as natural bodies, act for an end, and this is evident from their acting always or nearly always in the same way so as to obtain the best result. So if you had a plant here and you put it in the windowsill, it would turn so that it faces the sun. And then if you were to turn it around so that the plant is actually leaning now away from the sun, of course, it turns back towards the sun. And Aquinas says it's not that the plant has intelligence. It's not that the plant is saying, hey, I need that sunlight for photosynthesis or something, but it acts for an end. It acts for a purpose that's good for it without any intelligence. And Aquinas says, how is this possible unless there's an intelligence governing the universe? If I cut my hand or cut my arm and the blood clots, it's not because I'm making it clot with my mind. It's not my intelligence that makes it clot. And it's not because, presumably, it's not because the blood or the platelets have intelligence and they say, oh, we need to go clot the blood so that, this person doesn't bleed to death. It just happens. It's just the blood clots, and it's not because the body itself has any intelligence, but it acts for an end. It acts for the end of preserving me. If I eat something, I don't have to concentrate on digesting it. My body just digests it, takes the nutrients out, without any intelligence of its own. And Aquinas says so clearly, there's this sort of regularity in nature, and the regularity is that things are acting for an end. The plant seeks the light. My blood tries to clot. My stomach digests food. All animal stomachs digest food, takes the nutrients from them without any intelligence being involved. So how is that possible? How is it possible that something lacking intelligence, something that's purely physical, would be able to act for an end unless there's an intelligence guiding it, governing it, as he puts it? So another way that you could kind of, or another argument you could make to explain what he's saying here is, imagine that you could see a row of targets for arrows. Excuse me. And let's say that you saw a bunch of arrows fly by and they were going in all directions, and some were sideways and some were backwards, and a couple of them hit targets, but most of them just flew by. It might be reasonable to say, well, the wind just blew those, or there was an explosion or something, but whatever happened, there was no intelligence involved. A couple of them hit targets and stuck into them, but that was just by accident. Clearly there was no pattern, there was no purpose, there was no intelligence there. Just a bunch of arrows flew by in a total lack of order. But on the other hand, let's say that you saw a line of targets for arrows, and each target you saw an arrow fly and hit the target, and then the next target, the arrow flew and hit the target, and then the next target, an arrow flew and hit the target. You could think, well, maybe the wind is just blowing these. I mean, it's not impossible. Again, all you can see is the targets, and all that you can see is that the arrows keep hitting the targets. And it could, it's not entirely impossible that this is just happening by chance, or that the wind is just blowing these things. but Aquinas would say isn't the much more reasonable inference, isn't the much more reasonable conclusion that there's somebody there shooting these arrows and aiming them, someone who has intelligence and has a purpose, and that these arrows keep hitting the target because they're being aimed by someone with intelligence who is, acting for a purpose, acting for the purpose of making the arrows hit the target. And he's saying it's the same what we see in the world. We see these things, sort of very metaphorically speaking, we see the arrow keep hitting the target as we see all of these things that lack intelligence continuing to act consistently and to act for a particular end. And he says, and so how would that happen? It could be chance, but isn't the much more reasonable inference to say that there must be an intelligence guiding all of this, making all of this happen? Again, sort of, guiding all of this, governing the world so that these things keep acting for these purposes. So that's the fifth way, which he calls the governance of the world. So those are the 5 ways by which Aquinas says reason can prove the existence of God. And again, it's really much more sort of philosophical God, a God as a first cause, as a necessary being, as a first mover, as an intelligence governing the world. He's not really talking about the God of Christianity, but he's obviously not saying that they're somehow separate or contradictory. But these are the 5 ways he says that unassisted natural human reason can prove the existence of God.